guys, so today I am doing my April wrap up. So I'm just going to get straight into it. The first book I'm going to talk about is one that I'm currently reading, so I can't really wrap it up for you guys because I don't really know anything that happens or what I think of it yet, but it's This Shattered World by Amy Kaufman and Megan Spooner. This is the second book in the Starbound trilogy. The first one was These Broken Stars, which I really enjoyed. The Starbound trilogy is one of those trilogies that follows characters in the same world, but it's not the same characters in every book. And the girl in this book is a military captain, and then she gets kidnapped by a guy who is classed as a rebel, so he's kind of like on the opposing side to what she's defending, and yeah, we'll see what happens from there. And I love these covers. The covers of the Starbound trilogy are stunning. They're the most beautiful covers I think I have ever seen. They're my favourite, and on the inside it's just as beautiful. I think they're amazing. So the same as I've done previously, I'm going to be running through the books that I read this month in the order of the ratings that I gave them. So starting with the lowest ratings and working my way up to the highest ratings. So the book that I read this month that I gave the lowest rating to was The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness. I rated this one 2 out of 5 stars, which for me is quite a low rating. I really didn't enjoy this one very much. So basically this is kind of like a YA contemporary slash fantasy. So the idea of it is that, you know how in a lot of YA like urban fantasy books there's all this stuff going on. If you just think of like Twilight or the Mortal Instruments, stuff like that, there's all this stuff going on in the background, but everyone else, you know, all the other humans are just living their normal daily lives. This book is about a bunch of teenagers who are just normal humans living their everyday lives, but they are aware of all that like fantasy stuff that's going on as well. They're just not a part of it. So I think that's a really cool concept. I just didn't really like how it was executed. I just wasn't really like drawn into the story, and I didn't really enjoy it. It just felt a little bit too weird for me, having this really serious contemporary story that had quite a depressing like tone to it, but to have all these supernatural elements in the background that weren't really significant to the story but were just there. And I feel like because of the idea that this book was trying to pull off, those supernatural elements felt a little bit comedic, and it was a bit of a spoof almost, or satirical kind of. I just felt like it was like a mixture of two really different things that didn't really go together very well for me. So the like supernatural sort of storyline, they call the kids that are involved in that the indie kids. First of all, I don't really get why they get called the indie kids. I didn't really like that whole thing either, and that whole storyline just didn't interest me whatsoever. And then in terms of the main contemporary sort of characters that we get in this novel, I just didn't really feel connected to any of them. I didn't really feel invested in their storylines, so I didn't really care what happened to them. My two favourite characters were Jared and Meredith, but yeah, otherwise I didn't really like any of them. I appreciated the inclusion of mental health issues and how the recovery process is something that's ongoing, and it's not necessarily like, oh, you're recovered, like everything's all good. Like it's something that continues probably for a long time for a lot of people, if not forever. Just personally for me, the whole thing was a little bit too gritty and a little bit too depressing. Like it didn't have a very positive sort of tone to it. And I would also give trigger warnings for this book for OCD, for eating disorders, and for alcoholism as well, or addiction. My second lowest rating for the month was The Steel Flea by Nikolai Leskov. This is another one of the Little Black Classics, and this one is one that was set in Russia during the 1800s. It's a short story, and it's kind of a really wacky kind of tale. It's kind of even hard to explain, but a Russian guy goes on a journey to find out how to make a steel flea, and it's kind of a little bit of competition between Russians and British people. It had, you know, that kind of political commentary going on. Some of it, I will say, did feel like it got a little bit lost in translation, because there were kind of jokes made with using language that just didn't really work, because obviously they tried to translate it, but it is hard to translate things where, you know, in English sometimes you'll have words with dual meaning, like you know, there are all the different types of there spelt different ways and they all mean different things. Things like that. I can't think of any specific examples, but there were a few things like that in this book where things were spelt differently than conventionally that was supposed to be a joke, but it didn't really work in English. So it was kind of a fun story, but it just didn't really work for me, and I didn't think it was like amazing or anything. So yeah. Next I have a 4-star read, which is Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. This one I have a full review on, which I will link in the information bar below if you want to know more about it, but this is another YA contemporary. It is set in Britain and it's about a girl who is coming up towards the end of high school. She's really obsessed with a YouTube podcast and she gets to meet the creator, and then things in her life kind of start changing and she's not quite sure where she's going with anything. So I really enjoyed this one. I highly recommend reading it if you're interested, and yeah, check out my review if you want to know more about this one. And finally, moving on to my 5-star reads for the month. I had a few, which is always good. The first one was a reread for me. It's Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This I first read when I was in high school, and that was about probably honestly 7 or 8 years ago. I read it when I was about 16 and I really enjoyed it back then. I really loved it, and I just hadn't reread it since then. I'd only read it that one time, and you know, sometimes when you read something once you can remember enjoying it but you don't necessarily remember anything specific about it. And I'm familiar with the general story because I have seen the movie a few times as well with Keira Knightley, which I really like, but I wanted to reread this to re-experience the whole thing. If you're, you know, trying to think about getting into classics and you don't know where to start, if the trope that is sometimes common in contemporary and fantasy YA of characters initially, you know, hating each other, like hate at first sight, but then they end up falling in love, if that's a trope that you really enjoy, I think you will like this book, so I can recommend it to you on that basis. I think that's something that's done really well in this book, and it just gives you all of the warm, like fuzzy feelings, and there's a couple scenes that are just like so cute you can't even stand it. So I really enjoyed this, and this is one of those books where you read it and you just wish you were one of them, like living in this house in the countryside and like doing all these social events and stuff. It just makes me wish I was there. So I really enjoyed reading this, and I'm so glad that I reread it this month. The next 5-star read that I had was The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is obviously another little black classic, and this one is set or was written in the 19th century in England, which, as I've said before, is a setting that I really like. And this one actually has 2 stories in it. So the first one is The Old Nurse's Story, and then the other one is Curious If True. The Old Nurse's Story was the one that I liked the most. I thought it was amazing. It was so good, and that's kind of why I gave this 5 stars. The other one was probably more like a 4-star for me, but I still really enjoyed it, and I didn't want to knock off a star because honestly the first story was so good. The first one is kind of a ghost story, and it was really creepy. Like, it actually scared me a little bit. Some of the imagery is just like, honestly, you could make a horror movie out of it. It was really good and really creepy and dark, so I liked that a lot. And then the second story is kind of a fairy tale retelling, sort of. It's about a guy who gets lost in the woods and ends up at a party with all these different fairy tale characters. So it's kind of fun to read, to try and like work out who's who and which person is meant to represent which fairy tale character. So I thought that was quite clever and quite well done. So I really enjoyed this, and highly recommend reading The Old Nurse's Story if you get a chance to, because it was so good and so creepy. My final 5-star read for the month was Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy by Cassandra Clare, Sarah Rees Brennan, Maureen Johnson and Robin Waserman. This is a collection of short stories that follow on from the Mortal Instruments series / all of that, the Infernal Devices, like the whole Shadowhunters world. This is a collection of 10 stories based on those characters. I don't want to go into it too much because knowing what happens in this can spoil the other books if you haven't read them previously, so I just want to give you like a real general sort of overview of this. Basically, I completely loved this. I like that you get cameos from all of the characters that you're already familiar with from the other Shadowhunters books. It was a nice sort of continuation on from City of Heavenly Fire, which is the 6th book in the Mortal Instruments series, but at the same time it kind of gave you some backstories on different characters as well, and I really enjoyed this a lot. There were a lot of stories within the story as well, because all of these stories are set at the Shadowhunter Academy, but through the different characters that come into it and stuff like that, some of them tell stories, so it kind of goes into that, and I really like stories within stories, so I thought that was really cool. And obviously fantasy school setting is something else that I really like, so that was really cool as well. Seeing the Shadowhunter school was awesome. There are some new characters that we're introduced to as well. My favourite new character is George. I love him. My favourite story out of all of them was the one called Born to Endless Night. I loved that one so much. It was my absolute favourite, and if I could have given that particular story like more than 5 stars, I honestly would have. Overall, I love this so much. So many of them I really loved and fell in love with, and reading this is like the most immersed that I've felt in the Shadowhunter world, and I think that's just the school setting. It just makes you really want to like be a part of it, especially with all these characters that we're familiar with. So really liked that. So that is my wrap up for April. Those are all the books I read. If you've read any of them, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you want to read any of them, let me know that as well, and I will see you guys with another video in a couple of days. Bye.